So I was thinking about what I should spend this 20 minutes on. I thought I would give you some background how I got into what I'm doing. I've had some involvement with the G and the R of GNR, genetics, which is another word for biotechnology, and R for robotics, which really refers to artificial intelligence. As many of you heard, I kind of encountered the idea of exponential growth in 1981 when I was studying technology trends and trying to time my technology projects. Started with the common wisdom that I can't predict the future, but discovered that the price, performance, and capacity of information technology follows a very predictable path and an exponential one, and Peter and I were talking about that earlier. I've had some involvement with biotechnology, but let me share with you how I encountered artificial intelligence, which was over half a century ago. So I fashioned myself an inventor when I was 5. My grandmother showed me this mechanical typewriter and a book she wrote on that typewriter called One Life Is Not Enough, which recounted the story of her mother, my great-grandmother, starting the first school that provided higher education for girls in Europe in 1868, which was taken over by her daughter, my grandmother, who then became the first woman to get a PhD in chemistry in Europe. And she recounts the story of the school and her own life. And she showed me the book and the typewriter. As a 5-year-old, I was much more interested in the typewriter. That was a magical machine to me, and that inspired me to become an inventor. When I was 12, I discovered the computer, which most people had not heard of. I would say most people had not heard the word computer. There are only a dozen computers in New York City. And I immediately had the idea that you could simulate reality as well as thinking and intelligence in a computer, and I thought about that for a couple of years. When I was 14, 1962, I wrote the leaders of the 2 opposing schools in artificial intelligence, schools of thought, the symbolic school and the connectionist school. So that bifurcation of artificial intelligence into these 2 warring camps started at about that time. Marvin Minsky was considered head of the symbolic school. He's been called the father of artificial intelligence. It's actually not well known that he actually invented the neural net in the early 50s, but he had come to reject that idea. He expounded the idea that you could define rules that would describe every intelligent activity. And I went to visit him. I wrote him a letter. He invited me up. He spent all day with me as if he had nothing else to do. He was a consummate educator. That started a mentorship for over half a century until his passing away over a year ago. And he said, "Where are you going now?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go see Professor Rosenblatt at Cornell." And he said, "Oh, don't waste your time with that." But I went there, and he was publicizing a machine called the perceptron. It was really the first popular neural net. And he was making fantastic claims for it. Can't quite do this now, but it's going to be able to translate languages and cure diseases and recognize speech and translate languages. And I couldn't do any of those things. And that led to a backlash, which was why Minsky and others were critical of it. So I went up there, I brought printed letters in different type fonts, and it could recognize them so long as it was in Courier 10. If it was any other type style, it didn't work. And he said, "But don't worry, we can take the output of one perceptron, feed it as the input to another one, feed the output of that to another perceptron, and keep adding layers. And as we add more and more layers, it'll get smarter and smarter and generalize, and we'll be able to do all these things." And I said, that's really interesting. Have you tried that? And how's that worked out? "Well, I haven't tried it yet, but it's high on our research agenda." So he died 9 years later, in 1971, never having tried that idea. Things didn't move quite as quickly in the 60s as they do today. Culturally, things moved pretty quickly in the 60s, but when it came to computers, things were still pretty slow. 1969, Minsky wrote a book with Seymour Papert called Perceptrons that proved the theorem that a perceptron, a neural net, couldn't solve a particular problem called the connectedness problem. And the problem was on the cover, that there were two maze-like images. One was fully connected, one was not. Humans could solve this problem easily, but it would take a minute or two. But the book proved the theorem, perceptrons could not solve that problem. And it wasn't a matter of making them more advanced or something. It just inherently, he proved mathematically, it couldn't solve this fairly simple problem that humans could solve. So the book was very successful in killing all the funding for neural nets for 25 years, something that Minsky told me he regretted shortly before he died because he saw the surge of success in neural nets. I wrote in my book, Ageless Virtual Machines, in 1999, that the theorem only applied to single-level neural nets. So this idea that Rosenblatt had of having multi-layer neural nets, the theorem didn't apply to that, and the limitations didn't apply to that. So I'd say a few decades after Rosenblatt died, people tried multi-layer neural nets. They could only do 3 or 4 neural nets, and that was not because of computational problems, that was because of a mathematical problem. For the mathematicians in the audience, it has to do with falling into a local minima or keeping the error surface concave. But for mathematical reasons, when we went beyond 3 or 4 levels, the information disintegrated. And the 3 or 4 level neural nets were a little bit smarter than 1 level. But they still couldn't do very much. And the big accusation against the AI field just 5 or 6 years ago is, you guys can't even tell the difference between a dog and a cat. Now that's actually a pretty subtle and difficult discrimination. Turns out that the difference between a dog and a cat is at level 15. And if you have a 3-level neural net, it's not going to be able to do that. And we couldn't go beyond 3 levels because of this math problem. About 5 or 6 years ago, that math problem was solved by a group of mathematicians, including some that I work with at Google. And now we could go to any number of levels. And indeed, then we could tell the difference between a dog and a cat. And with 100-level neural nets, the best programs can distinguish between thousands of different categories and do it better than humans. And this has led to this surge of interest in artificial intelligence. So 2 things really account for this tremendous surge of interest in AI. It's the solving of this math problem and the law of accelerating returns, because we have more and more powerful computers and memories and lots of data. That's one of the reasons I'm at Google. There's still a problem, though, which is there's a motto in the field that life begins at 1 billion examples. And we have 1 billion examples of some things, like pictures of dogs and cats. But there's a lot of things we don't have that kind of data about. That's actually the principal difference now between AI and human intelligence. Humans can learn from a small amount of information. Your significant other or your boss tells you something once, maybe twice. You might actually learn from that. Some people have been reported to do that. And that's something that these neural nets are not able to do. We don't always have 1 billion examples. So I'd say the big research challenge now is to find a way around that. DeepMind, in winning the Go competition, created their own data. There was about 1 million moves online of master Go games, so they trained it on those 1 million moves. Now that's not 1 billion, that's only 1 million, and it created a fair Go player, but even an average amateur could beat that program. So then they created an unlimited amount of data by having the program play itself, kind of similar to how humans might actually think through a problem on their own. And we can annotate each move because we know how which side of the simulated game would win, and there's other ways to evaluate moves. And now we could create an unlimited amount of annotated examples. And so it just kept improving until it soared past, the best players in the world. So that's one approach. I have another approach, which I think is actually how humans do it. So that same year, 1962, I wrote a paper, How I Thought the Human Brain Worked. I didn't have much to go on. There was very little neuroscience. There was one neuroscientist that had something to say that was of interest, which was Vernon Mountcastle. The common wisdom at that time is we knew about different regions of the neocortex. It's the V1 in the back of the head where the optic nerve spills into. That can tell me that this is a straight line. There's the fusiform gyrus up here, which can recognize faces. We know that because if you knock it out through injury or stroke, people can't recognize faces, although they will relearn that skill using a different region of the brain. There's the famous frontal cortex, which enables us to do language and music and humor. These regions do such different things, they must be using different algorithms, different methods. Vernon Mountcastle did autopsies of the neocortex in different regions, and so they all looked the same. They had the same repeating pattern, and that pattern didn't seem to matter how old the individual was. It stayed the same throughout life. And he said, neocortex is neocortex. So I had that clue, and I described the brain as a series of modules. Each of the modules is pretty much the same. It can learn a pattern. It actually learns a pattern as a sequence, a linear sequence. So even if we're learning a pattern like a chair, you might think, well, that's a three-dimensional object. It's not a linear sequence, but we actually are able to use these linear sequences to understand complicated patterns. And they're organized in a hierarchy. That was the magic of the neocortex. It could actually understand hierarchies, and the world is organized hierarchical, so that's why evolution devised the neocortex 200 million years ago with mammals. Trees have a trunk, which has branches, which have more branches, which lead to leaves. There's a natural hierarchical structure to the world. And with the ability to understand the world hierarchically, we can actually invent new behaviors. So pre-mammalian animals that didn't have a neocortex, they had fixed behaviors. But they were very well evolved for their ecological niches. Mammals came along. The first ones were basically rodents, and they could invent new behaviors. Didn't help them that much because the environment changed very slowly. It might take 50,000 years for it to be an environmental change that would require a new behavior, and these non-mammalian animals over that period of time could actually evolve a new fixed behavior. So the mammals, that were like this big, kind of stayed out of the way for 135 million years. But then something happened. 65 million years ago, there was a sudden catastrophic change to the environment. If you go down to a layer of rock that reflects 65 million years ago, the geologists will explain that that shows a sudden violent change to the environment. And we see it all around the globe. And we call it the Cretaceous extinction event because that's when the dinosaurs went extinct. That's when 75% of all the animal species went extinct. And that's when mammals took over. And so now mammals got bigger, their bodies got bigger, their brains got bigger even faster, taking up a larger fraction of their body. The neocortex, which is the outer layer of the brain, got bigger even faster than that, developed these curvatures. It's now, in a human brain, about 80% of the brain, and it's where the action is. That's where we do our thinking. So something else happened 2 million years ago. If you remember, we were walking around. We didn't have these big foreheads. If you look at other primates, they have a slanted brow. But they were doing a very good job of being primates. But evolution figured, well, this neocortex is pretty good stuff. How can we get more of it? And it created the frontal cortex. And so what did we do with it? Well, as I said, we were doing a very good job of being primates. So we put it at the top of the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is like a pyramid. So as you add more of it, even if you're adding 20% more neocortex, it could double or triple the number of levels in the hierarchy. That was the enabling factor for us to invent language, art, music. Every human culture we've ever discovered has music. No primate cultures have music, humor, and technology, as I mentioned with Peter, along with this opposable appendage so that we could take our imagination of what we could do with the world and actually make changes and create tools that were sophisticated enough to create new tools, and we had a whole evolutionary process of technology. So I had this model. I submitted it to a science contest, got to meet President Johnson, and started thinking about thinking for 50 years. My most recent book, How to Create a Mind, which came out in 2012, articulates this now, but now we have an explosion of neuroscience evidence to support it. The European Brain Reverse Engineering Project has identified a repeating pattern of about 100 neurons each. So there's about 300 million out of the 30 billion neurons we have in the neocortex of these modules. And we can actually see them connecting themselves into hierarchies. And we also see that there's no plasticity, no change within each module. It stays fixed throughout life, but the pattern that each module learns and the kind of hierarchy that self-organizing is created with our own thinking. So that's the model I have. As we discussed earlier, that got me hired at Google. I've been creating these simulations of these models. They're not perfect models yet of the neocortex, but we're learning more and more about how the brain works. But they're good enough actually to begin to understand language. But these self-organizing neural nets, the connectionist school has really taken over. We discovered that we really can't define the world in terms of rules because the world is too flexible and the rules become brittle, and then you try to fix something and it breaks two other things, and there's a complexity ceiling to trying to define things in terms of rules, whereas we can actually define much more subtle and complicated ways of doing things with these connectionist systems. And it is basically amplifying our technology, amplifying our intelligence. There's been controversy recently about promise versus peril, which Peter and I also alluded to earlier. But there's been promise versus peril with every technology. I think we go through 3 phases in contemplating these exponential technologies. The first is delight. It's like, wow, this exponential technology has the potential to overcome these age-old problems of humanity. Then alarm, that they also have the potential to cause great harm. And finally, I think where we should end up is a cautious optimism that, first of all, we have a moral imperative to continue improving these technologies, because it's only these exponential technologies that will alleviate the continuing suffering in the world. We've made tremendous progress. This is the wealthiest, healthiest, most peaceful time in human history, but there's still a lot of suffering to go around, and it's only continued advance in these exponential technologies that will get us to go where we want while we contain the peril. And one good example of our ability to actually do that is in biotechnology. We've had the Asilomar guidelines from an Asilomar conference actually 4 decades ago, and we're now seeing benefit. As you've heard at this conference, we can fix a broken heart, not yet from romance. That's going to take some more advances in virtual reality, but from a heart attack, we can grow organs. I'm involved with a company where we're actually growing organs, kidneys, lungs, and hearts, and installing them successfully in animals, and this is coming to a human near you soon. These are just a couple of examples. It's a trickle of impact today. It'll be a flood in 10 years. The number of people who've been harmed by abuse of biotechnology, either intentional or accidental, so far has been 0 because of the Asilomar guidelines. That doesn't mean we can cross it off our list. Okay, we took care of that one because the technology keeps getting more sophisticated, like, for example, the recent advent of CRISPR, which you just heard about. So we have to keep reinventing the guidelines, but it's a good model for how we can do exactly what we want, which is yield the promise while we contain the peril. We just had our first Asilomar conference on AI ethics in January, and I believe similar ideas will be able to succeed, but it's not automatic. I think that is the great challenge for humanity, is to continue to yield the promise, apply it in the right way so that we actually address human problems while we keep the technology safe and contain the peril. I'm personally optimistic. I think you have to be an optimist to be an entrepreneur, which is what I've been my whole life. You'd never start any project if you were aware of all the challenges that you would encounter. But it's only optimism that can succeed in the world. Optimism is not an idle speculation about the future. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's what we're trying to foster here at Singularity University. Thank you very much. Yeah.